Okay, Assalamu alaikum everybody. I hope you are doing well and enjoying kind of the start of the school year. Things are getting so busy that it's crazy. We've been so overwhelmed with all kinds of things, and so we'll talk a little bit too, because I know we were really ambitious about wanting to do these every 2 weeks, and now we're forced to see that we have a limit to our energy, as much as our intention would love to even do this more. So we might adjust things going forward. But our next meeting time after this will be October 6th. And I had mentioned it before, we're going to do a conversation with Professor Nader Hashemi and the professor on his book, Reasoning with God. So that'll be really, really interesting. So today I wanted to start by talking a little bit about prayer. And we've been asking Dr. Abou El Fadl to talk about sort of the theology of prayer and the meaning of prayer and all those sorts of things. So I'm really hoping that we'll do that sometime soon, and that I won't have to wait 6 years like Sharif having to ask, wait 6 years for Surah al Rahman. But I wanted today just to talk a little bit about sort of my personal experience with prayer and share some reflections. Just because I think prayer is one of those things that, I honestly believe that it's as individual as your relationship with God. But I don't often hear people kind of talk about sort of the journey and the ups and downs and how things change over time. And I'm hoping that that may be valuable. It's a testimony of one, and this may be only my experience with it. But I feel like right now, again, it's so important to share stories, and if anyone can benefit from your own experiences, then it's helpful to share that. Oftentimes, we read about prayer, and it seems like there's this expectation that we're supposed to be perfect, and that prayer for everyone else might be something that is much more unattainable than it is for ourselves. So I think it's important just to kind of share some of these things. I know, before I became Muslim, the whole idea of prayer, people would say to me, and even my family would say to me, well, we'll pray for you, because I come from a Christian family, and I was sort of the outcast as someone who converted to Islam, and so it was kind of a dig at me. They would say to me, well, I hope you're well, and we're praying for you. To which I would always respond, well, thank you, I'm praying for you too. And so, but it's, it's one of those things where when I hear people say, I'm praying for you, or we'll pray, I would sort of feel like that was a bit of a cop-out, because it's kind of like, okay, fine, you'll pray for me, but you're not really going to do anything else, and thank you very much. And so I, kind of didn't really think that that meant very much at that time. But, over time, my feelings about prayer have changed. And, just to tell a quick story about my family, which is just kind of, my professor said to me before we started, he's like, try to contain your naughtiness. And so I don't know if I'm going to do that, but anyway, I'll just still share some stories. I remember one of my family, just to let you know, is primarily Christian. I have one cousin who is a pastor in Southern California, and another cousin who is married to a pastor, and I guess he's a pastor too. They have their own church in China, and they are teaching Aborigines English, and in the process converting people to Christianity. I have another cousin who was an elder in Jehovah's Witnesses and recently left that, and then other cousins who are in sort of various denominations of Christianity. But so one night we were all together, and someone in our family was ill. So my eldest uncle kind of called all of us together, and we sat around the table and said, okay, well, let's do a prayer circle. And he wanted us to kind of go around and everybody say a prayer. And so I thought, well, this is going to be very interesting, because they're probably all wondering what I'm going to say from my evil Muslim book. But so I thought, I'm going to share with them the Fatiha, because I'm sure that they probably have not heard anything from the Quran. And for me, when I was learning about Islam, it was really important to me when I was learning to pray that I didn't just memorize the Arabic. I actually wanted to know what I was saying, the meaning of it. So I made a point to memorize Al-Fatiha at least, because we say that more than anything else. So we went around the circle, and I was last, and I was like, okay, well, in the name of God, most gracious, most beneficent, all praise be to God, cherisher and sustainer of the world. He is indeed all compassionate and most merciful, master of the day of judgment. To you alone we pray, and from you alone we seek all help. Show us, O Lord, the straight path, the path of those whom you have blessed, not of those who have chosen to go astray. And I remember that now. I haven't really said it in English in a long time, but it was really, I tried to burn it into my brain. And I love that when I said that, the eyes of my family just opened oh my God, that sounds so familiar. And they had to contain their surprise, because of course they didn't want to admit that anything Islamic could actually be beautiful. But anyway, inside I was like, yes. So anyway, so that was kind of like early on, and I remember, most people probably don't remember the very first time that they put their face on the floor, because I was like 25 years old, and I wanted to try it. I was not Muslim, and I was sort of captivated because like everyone else, you see images in the media and the movies of people praying, and it was a little bit of a scary thing. But, when you're approaching this from sort of an attitude of curiosity, from a positive perspective, I just really wanted to know what it felt to do sujood, do the bow. And, it's a hard thing. 25 years of your life, you've never put your face on the floor. I mean, why would you? The only time maybe you have a quarter in your hand, you drop it, it rolls under the bed, and the most you do is get under the bed. But, most times people will be like, whatever, I'm not picking that up, because I'm not bowing down and picking that up. So when you actually become, in your mindset, I'm going to actually do this 5 times a day at least, and maybe more, it's a completely different thing. And I felt, like the physicality of the humility, like when you bow down and you put yourself on the floor. It was a very different experience, and it was a very beautiful experience. And so that was, before I became Muslim. After I became Muslim, I learned how to pray through reading a book and having some advice from friends. And after I converted, my friend told me, okay, well, you have to pray, 2 rakahs sunnah before Fajr. Then you pray 2 rakahs for Fajr. At Dhuhr, you pray 4 rakahs beforehand for sunnah, and then you pray 4 rakahs of Dhuhr, and then 4 rakahs of sunnah after, and then another 2 rakahs. And then at Asr, you pray 4 rakahs, but nothing after for sunnah. And then Maghrib, you pray 3 rakahs, and then 2 rakahs after for sunnah. And then for Aisha, you pray 4 rakahs for the prayer, and then 4 rakahs sunnah, and then 3 rakahs shafa, 2 rakahs witr, or 4 rakahs, or, it was just like on and on. 3 rakahs, 2 rakahs, 1 rakah, shafa, witr, and 4 sunnah. So I was like, oh my God, okay, that's a lot of praying. But you know what? I'm a perfectionist, and if I'm going to be a good Muslim, I'm going to do it right. So I'm going to pray all those prayers. And at that time, I was working in a corporate environment. And so, this is hard. It's like, I was in brand management. It was an intense job. And you definitely don't want to talk about who you are as, outside, or that admit you're a Muslim. So I would literally go and sneak around and look for an empty conference room or look for an empty office. And I would be like, oh God, okay, please let me finish my prayers without anyone walking in on me. And it was, it was a lot. And I tried my best, but I genuinely did. And, prayer became very much, if I was single at the time, so it's kind of like, okay, if I'm going to go to the mall, I have to think about where am I going to go pray. I'll go find a dressing room somewhere in Macy's, and, it's like it became a logistical scheduling every single day of where am I going to pray. So, when you're starting out, I think that's a good thing because, it changes your orientation and it makes you think about, prayer being integrated in your life. But it was much more about sort of checking in and accounting and making sure that angels knew that I made it on time and whatever, and much less about building my relationship with God. People told me, yes, when you pray, you should think about seeing the face of God. But at that point, it was just more of a logistical organization issue, which was fine, which was actually very good. And then over time, I also, I really enjoyed the idea of prayer. And one of my favorite things, actually, about prayer when I was a young Muslim was praying with other people. Because I felt like, I was on a different program. I was on a different journey. And I was part of now this group of people that came together because of their love of God. And so it was a very special kind of thing. After I met and married Dr. Abou El Fadl, then I learned that there were shortcuts that I could take. So I could combine prayers if I couldn't make prayer. If I travel, I don't have to pray all the prayers. That it was okay that I didn't pray all of those prayers. And, it was also a really lovely thing because prayer, I now had very beautiful human examples of, and role models for what prayer should mean in your life. So it became, where it used to be a very hidden kind of private affair, taking that time, I saw, what does it mean to just literally get up and pray in the room, bow, it's not a big deal, it doesn't matter if anyone's watching you, because I was very self-conscious, in the beginning. And then over time, it's no, you need to pray, you get up and you pray. If you can pray, if you all pray together, that's the best thing, and so we would do that. And it was just not a big deal, but it was something that was very natural, eating and sitting with the family, or, but beautiful. So that was also quite lovely. So in terms of, and then over time, I would think, people are become very obsessed with this idea of, do I feel it? What do I feel when I'm praying? And oftentimes, I would feel connected to God more than others, and other times I wouldn't. So early on it was just a yoga act, right, where you're basically bowing and doing all of that. But I started to get glimpses of the connection with the divine and the feeling of peace and all of that over time. It became less of a logistical exercise and more of an engagement with God. And I would feel it especially when I would go to sort of beautiful places like mosques where a lot of people prayed. So you kind of felt the energy of all the people that had prayed there before. And sometimes I would feel, like it at home. But many times I didn't really feel anything. I would just go through the motion. And, but it's okay. I felt like this is something I wanted to do and I was committed to do. I wanted to share a story that a friend of mine, recently, we were talking about teaching our children to pray. And, she's a professor and she teaches Islamic studies, and she says, I have a lot of people that come to me and they say, I just don't feel it, so I don't want to pray. And I always tell people, you should, the prayer is not about just feeling it. It's the habit. It's doing it and, getting into that. Just creating the habit, whether you feel it or not, the feeling will come later, but you shouldn't wait for the feeling to come because it may never come. But if you pray, it may actually come. So I, now after it's been, 23 years or whatever that I've been Muslim, the thing that's very surprising to me is how the feeling of prayer has changed for me. And I feel very grateful. I've said this before, and I'm a little bit embarrassed to say it, but it's I've never missed a prayer. I don't see it as a means of showing off or whatever. I've definitely been late for prayer. I've definitely gone a whole day without praying because I'm sick or whatever, too busy. But I always go back and make up those prayers because part of me is just I cannot rest until I know I'm caught up on prayer. But I feel like what has changed for me is the feeling of sort of plugging in. And especially now, when we live in a world where there's so much stuff that makes you really upset and depressed and unhappy, and you feel like you just need a respite, you need a way to kind of go back and feel the peace and the beauty. The thing that has really surprised me, that if someone had told me 23 years ago, is that now, when I feel when I pray, I was thinking, what's the best way to sort of say what it feels like? When you're really tired and you go home and you climb into bed and your sheets are clean and they're comfortable and you're oh, I'm so exhausted, and you lay down and you're and you feel beautiful and connected. It's like that, but so much better. And, and it's something that has taught me it's not about prayer as an act, but it's a means to developing a relationship with God. So it's not about necessarily the motions, because I've always felt I have kind of a constant conversation happening with God, whether I am physically praying or not. If I'm driving, and I swear that the professor always laughs at me, I'm even if I'm looking for a parking space, I'm always please God, help me find a parking space. And I swear to God, every single time I get a great parking space. But, just the idea that, we know that God is really engaged with you. God knows exactly what's going on with your life, with your heart, with your thoughts, that even before it leaves your mind, God knows. And if you really believe that and you really reflect on that, it's a beautiful thing because God is your partner. And God can be your partner if you want God to be your partner. And what hurts my heart a lot of times is, we meet a lot of people who ask, for assistance, or they're, depressed, or they're unhappy, and the first thing that leaves is the prayer. They either stop praying, or they don't pray as much, or they feel like they're being a hypocrite because they've done something wrong, and why should I pray? Because God probably is angry at me. And all of those things, what we know is that the first way that the shaitan will pull you away from God is to somehow convince you to stop praying. So, or pray less, or, somehow interrupt that connection to the divine. And it's really important that even when you think you've done everything wrong, that you continue to pray, because you're just saying, God, I'm here and I'm still with you and I need you. And as I tell my son, when I'm teaching him about God, I say, you don't want God to forget about you. Because, when you remember God, God will remember you. If you stop praying, God is going to stop thinking of you. And you do not want to be in this world, especially the way the world is now, alone. You need God. And God can overcome any darkness and, overpower any evil. But you need to be on the side of God. You're either on the side of God or you're not. And that prayer is so important. And then the other very beautiful Quranic passage about, dhikr Allah, the remembrance of God, which is something that I've come to learn more about as I've gotten older, is when God says, those who remember me, I sit with them. Remember me and I will sit with you. And just the idea, God will sit with me and be with me. And it's just such a point of comfort. So I always tell people, no matter what, don't stop praying. And even if you don't feel anything, if someone told me how I would feel now, I would not really have felt it or believed it. But it is, it's something worth never letting go of. So that's my story for today. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, we finished Surah al Rahman, and we are going to continue with the Juz al-Thalathin, the 30th part of the Quran, which is the last part. And as I said before, there are recordings of the other surah that I've dealt with that are available, and if you haven't heard them, please do that, because Tafsir is a cumulative activity, and you build on a structural program of knowledge in which you frequently refer to what has already been established. So the next step is to deal with surah that I have not dealt with as of now. And for reasons, quite frankly, that I don't remember, I had skipped over Surah al-Fath, إذا جاء نصر الله والفتح, and I also skipped over Surah al-Humazah, وَيْلٌ لِكُلِّ هُمَزَةٍ لُمَزَةٍ. So I have to go back and deal with these, so that and then inshallah we continue from there until we deal with the entire juz, or we finish the entire juz. Before though, a couple of important points. One of them, an issue that I just can't let go of. I am imploring people that are watching this. This will be my shahada, my testimony before Allah on the final day, that I have begged and implored and begged, in every sense of the word, to help me save Islamic manuscripts. And if you donate money, earmark the money, either say that this is for the Usuli Institute, and the Usuli Institute does need your support because we can't really do anything without financial backing, or say that this money is earmarked for saving a manuscript. And what I want to do is to have people adopt a manuscript. So you could contact us and say, I would like to adopt a manuscript, but here's the amount that I can spend on a manuscript, whatever the amount is. And then I will take the amount, and of course the process of making sure that the manuscript is authentic and valuable and important for Islamic history, and etc., that's my job. The authentication of manuscripts is, as I've said before, it's a critical skill, but in short supply. There are a few good people around the world that specialize in this, but anyway. So then, whatever the amount is, and the manuscript that is adopted that would be the manuscript adopted, and inshallah we will preserve it in the Usuli Institute, owned in the Usuli Institute, but the manuscript would be known as the manuscript saved by X, Y, or Z, whoever the person is. If, of course, if you want to be named, if you want to be anonymous, that's also, because we did have the Nabulsi manuscript was saved by someone who didn't want to be named, they wanted to remain anonymous. But may Allah reward that person forever, because the Nabulsi manuscript, people who are listening to me might have no clue how important Nabulsi is to Islamic history, and how important the fact that this manuscript from Syria, for that Syrian Shami scholar, generations forever will be grateful and leave alone the ajr from Allah for saving a manuscript like that. Remember that knowledge, what the fancy word that we use is epistemology. Whatever knowledge we assume, it is built on a cumulative process of accumulation, or a progressive process of accumulation. In other words, everything you think you know because you've been told. Knowledge is acquired through a communicative act. And with people that have died, past generations, the only way we can communicate with them in a verifiable fashion is through texts. Yeah, you could go and do a seance and call their spirit and have a conversation with them. That's your business if you're insane enough to do that. But that has no value. We don't build knowledge on that. We build knowledge through text. So whatever you think Islam represents to you, and represents to your children, and represents for future generation, the testimony, the shahada that has been preserved in these texts is our gateway to Islamic epistemology and to communities of meaning in the Islamic heritage. And so when you preserve these texts, you are doing nothing less than preserving Islam itself. Islam as it is for us as human beings on this earth. And as I've said before, this is not conspiracy theory, this is just practical. You wake up and you smell the roses. There are a lot of interests that, for whatever reasons, that have vested material interests in disintegrating, disseminating, and deconstructing the Islamic tradition. Whether that manifests in book burnings and that people were caught burning Sufi manuscripts in Maghrib and they were arrested and tried. But in Maghrib at least they have a police. But whether it happens in Egypt, which it does, or in Sudan, or in Somalia, which it does, or in Ethiopia, which it does, or the manuscripts of Iraq and Syria that have been dispersed and many of them lost, or end up with particular political interests that are extremely hostile to the Islamic tradition and that only give access to these manuscripts to people who work to deconstruct the Islamic tradition. That's the reality, people. That's the reality. That's not storytelling. That's not conspiracy. That's not craziness. That is a historical narrative that will be told eventually. That the story of Islam and modernity. So when I see these manuscripts on places like eBay, and I know a lot of the manuscripts, we have a record of them in Sizgin or Brockelman, so we know that they used to be housed in a Syrian, can you close the door please? That they used to be housed in the Syrian library, or they used to be housed in a library in Iraq, or now we're even seeing manuscripts from places like Samarkand, which used to be a huge center for Islamic manuscripts, but the genocide that is taking place with Islamic manuscripts is mind-boggling. And I think it has very clear political interests vested in making sure the memory of Islamic discourses on meaning is engineered and navigated so that it will be represented by a certain type of discourse, but not other discourses. And that's very dangerous because we don't have a right to do that. And I always tell young scholars when we talk about decolonialism and interest, I say, far more important for thinking about the project of decolonialism is to save the tradition and think in material ways about saving tradition, rather than sit and indulge yourself in the egotistical process of theorizing theories of post-colonial cultural constructions. It reminds me a lot of people when Palestine was being lost, and there were Jewish immigrants buying up Palestinian lands and committing massacres and forcing Palestinians to leave their land, and Europe and France, England and France and Russia and the US were all conspiring to destroy Palestine and so on. And there were these writers in the 40s, late 40s and 50s, who would sit there and theorize about the workers' movement and communism and the bourgeois and the proletariat and how there will be movements of unity between the worker class in Egypt and Iraq and Syria with the poor workers, immigrants in Israel or in Palestine, and all this theory was of course to naught. Palestine was lost, and all the theory is worth nothing now, garbage. It was all pooped on. because all the dreams about the labor movement and the Labor Party and so on. Look at what the Labor Party did. The Israeli Labor Party did with the Palestinians. So, when are Muslims going to wake up and emerge out of their bubble and think in terms of, it's remarkable that the same people who silenced a lot of Muslim intellectuals by telling them, oh, all Muslims are conspiracy theory oriented and they're paranoid, and the Muslim, that book that was being read in the 80s very widely called The Arab Mind, written by an Israeli scholar. And I know at the time I know so many intellectuals, Muslim intellectuals. It's like, you can't talk about conspiracy terms. Look, it's backwards. It's reactionary. Did you read The Arab Mind? Did you read The Arab Mind? And those same people today are the authors of Islamophobia and the imagining of a Muslim conspiracy to take over the world. They're the same people. Bernard Lewis and his students made the same narrative that shamed Muslims about thinking in mega terms, has turned the table and now thinks about Muslims in mega terms. Adopt a manuscript. Adopt a manuscript. Make sacrifices. I'm talking to people who might listen, and I know that these recordings make their way to many countries, and I get messages from people in Europe and Canada and Australia and New Zealand and Indonesia and Malaysia and so on, and so the recordings make their way around. So to those people, I'm saying, make the financial sacrifice and adopt a manuscript. Make a statement by preserving something in the Islamic intellectual heritage, because that's all we've got. That's all we have. Okay. Now, before dealing with Surah al-Fajr or al-Humaza, just one of my madhab and my fundamental belief is that if you wish to be a Muslim intellectual, and when I say a Muslim intellectual, meaning that was committed Islamic normativities and thinking through the tradition, or if you wish to be simply a good Muslim, you must be anchored in the Quran. And when anchoring in the Quran, the process of revelation in the Quran itself is a pedagogy of how to become anchored in the Quran. The reason we start out with the short surah and the surah that mostly were revealed in Mecca is because these are the surah that morally and ethically construct a Muslim character. The consciousness of a Muslim, the ethical being of a Muslim. Now, of course, later surah, the longer surah, engaged variety of historical unfoldings and engage them often in an educational, metaphorical fashion. And what I mean by that is that in every set of historical circumstance that unfolded to the Prophet ﷺ, Allah engaging this Prophet and the community of the Prophet in a fashion that is constantly morally instructive. But you cannot begin with that you must anchor yourself through a systematic pedagogical process by which you start out with the morals and ethics of a Muslim character, the foundations of a Muslim character, before you can even think about law. And so, you know, sometimes you just don't want to create trouble. Greece is trouble oriented. I'm sort of trouble averse. Well, I try to be. I always end up creating it anyway. But you know, among contemporary Muslims, you often feel that, and I'm not talking about academics. I'm talking about Muslim activists and so on. You often feel that they like to talk about law and justice and Sharia because it's cool, because it makes them feel like they're I don't know, lawyers, jurists, fuqaha. But law is a technical endeavor. It's a very specialized endeavor. And a technical endeavor without the moral foundations becomes a very twisted and immoral, often immoral or immoral endeavor. And that's extremely problematic. And that is why when I often see contemporary Muslims, they want to talk about law. And they say, oh, let's have a conference about justice in Islam. Or let's have and I say, the priority right now is morality in Islam, ethics. The foundation of a Muslim character. After having spent my entire life studying law, very few people, I think, are technically advanced enough to talk law with. Because first, I need to know that you have the moral foundation, the ethical foundation. And this is in the Tafsir on the 30th part of the Quran, is what the pedagogy that we are engaged in. Now, note that Allah warns us about those, and Allah's talking about Muslims when Allah says, Nasu zikr, fakanu qawman bura. Those who have the Quran in their midst, the dhikr, right in their midst, but they do not have a relationship with that dhikr. It's not just a matter of reading the Quran daily. Some people say, oh, you know, I read the juz every night. No, great. But do you live with that juz every night? I would rather you even just live with a few ayat every night, but truly live with them, than just finish a set amount of reading. Now, most Muslims don't finish a set amount, don't even bother. I mean, maybe they'll read the Quran occasionally in Ramadan, or when someone dies, or to me that's disastrous. That's how you end up, like the Muslims. There were some Muslims. We have some very dangerous fashions rising in the Muslim world. Among those most dangerous fashions, in my humble opinion, are not so humble, because I truly, strongly believe in that, in a very non-humble way. Muslims say, Salah, Bunya al-Islam ala khams, there are 5 pillars to the faith. Oh, that's old-fashioned and non-scholarly, and nothing is more dangerous than that. Or Muslims who, like some Muslims recently told me, the vast majority of Muslims don't even pray. And so, how can you say you can't really be a Muslim unless you pray? Because that's what Allah said. And, if that's reactionary, then fine. Then I am reactionary. critical in that are Muslims who are trying to humanize the Quran and mitigate the idea of revelation. I don't know if you know, these are like fashions now among Muslims in Europe and France and in England and Australia and so on. Oh, you know, we don't accept that Gabriel really appeared to the Prophet, and you know, it was all revelation internally, going through the consciousness of the Prophet, and so the Quran is really it's, you know, it sounds hot and cool, and some Muslims will never memorize the Quran and sit there and say, well, you know, there is a difference between the dhikr and the furqan and the kitab, and you know, if you have it, I don't even want to give, you know, do the honor of explaining these things, but they're hitting so many young Muslims in the West, and the net result of it is that to mitigate, and not mitigate, to even create an alienated relationship between a Muslim identity and a Quranic identity. And these things are extremely dangerous.
If you say what they are, then people can recognize them as dangerous.
Yeah, but then, I mean, I'm summarizing them, and maybe if people have questions, then I'm summarizing them in just the thesis. The idea that, well, to deconstruct the notion that Islam has 5 pillars, to deconstruct the notion that Muslim identity can exist without Salah. And so, you know, the idea that, well, I'm Muslim because I'm saying I'm Muslim, and it's not that I don't pray and I feel guilty about it, it's that I don't pray and I think that's what Allah wants. That's extreme. That's what I find disastrous. I mean, there's a difference between someone who says, I don't do my salah, and I'm very sorry about it, and someone who says, I don't do my salah, and I'm proud of it because I don't believe Allah wants me to do salah. That's disastrous. And the intellectualization of these positions is what I find extremely dangerous. But they are igniting all over the Muslim world. Even places like Saudi and Egypt, amongst intellectuals and you know, people who think they're call themselves intellectuals, you know, these things are just popping everywhere, and among them is, well, the Quran, you know, you can gain wisdom separate and apart from the Quran, and we really need the Quran to have wisdom and civilization and hikmah. And these are the types of positions that I am referring to. But anyway, the reason I bring them up is to make clear that as far as I am concerned, Muslim hikmah is anchored in the doctrine of the Quran and the text of the Quran. And as far as I'm concerned, it is not progressive Islam to deconstruct Salah or deconstruct the centrality of the Quran to Islamic morality. For me, it is regressive and destructive. I don't even know if I would call it Islam. It's something else. And I want to be very clear about that. As you've heard me about Surah al-Rahman, and you've heard me about the various other surahs that I've dealt with, and inshallah you hear me about the surahs we'll deal with, the entire Islamic edifice, the entire Islamic normative project is anchored in the revelation of the Quran. And anyone that wants to build their Islamic character, and in my belief, if you truly, I spent my entire life studying this book, and I wish I had 100 more lifetimes to continue studying this book, because there's just simply not enough time. One lifetime is not enough. And I have not been able to reach at any point a point where I say, okay, well, I'm ready to move on to other things. I lost my train of thought. Where was I?
The entire Islamic edifice is anchored
Oh,
in
yeah.
revelation.
Yeah, the entire Islamic edifice is anchored in the Quranic revelation, and as as if you listen to the past halaqas and the current one, inshallah, you see a systematic process. The point that I want to, in fact, if you anchor yourself in the morality of the Quran and in the relationship that the Quran facilitates for you between you and your Maker, you do not need any of the new agey things that come up. Whether what do you call chaos magicians and all that stuff, nifty stuff. I'm reading a book now about black magic, and I'm like reflecting on how crazy. Anyway, so those Muslims who nasul zikr, who abandon their relationship to the dhikr, to the Quran, become manbura. They become, and bura here is a fascinating expression because they become a people as if empty people. They become people that are impoverished and meaningless. Very much like descriptions of humanity in the postmodern condition: uprooted, restless, anxious, unanchored in a normative paradigm, and it's wonderfully captured in this expression qawman bura, that in fact, and very much as we see in the Muslim, all around in the Muslim world, the chaos that the Muslim world is in, you lose your anchoring in the revelation and you become an uprooted people, very much like a displaced people without rootedness in anything. Okay, so Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Surah al Nasr, sometimes in the tradition called Surah al Wada'. إذا جاء نصر الله والفتح ورأيت الناس يدخلون في دين الله أفواجا فسبح بحمد ربك واستغفره إنه كان توابا. Very short surah. Does someone have the tafsir? The translation? Amanda, translation woman?
I can do translation. Surah al Nasr.
This is
When God's help comes and He opens up your way. You going to read the whole thing?
yeah.
Okay. When God's help comes and He opens up your way, when you see people embracing God's faith in crowds, celebrate the praise of your Lord and ask His forgiveness. He is always ready to accept repentance.
Okay, so it's straightforward enough in its language. The reason that it was called Surah al Wada', or the farewell surah, is that it is among the very last surah revealed in the Quran. Whether it was revealed a year before the Prophet's death, ﷺ, or whether it was revealed 2 years before, or even a shorter period than that, we have various reports. And there are reports that this surah was revealed shortly, or a period of time. How much time? Again, you read a lot of reports about that, before the rather famous Surah اليوم أكملت لكم دينكم ورضيت لكم الإسلام دينا. Today I have completed the revelation and Islam and accepted Islam as your religion, which is reported to be among the very last revelation. There are reports that there is an ayah that was revealed after that, or days before the death of the Prophet ﷺ, وَاتَّقُوا يَوْمًا تُرْجَعُونَ فِيهِ إِلَى اللَّهِ. Be mindful of the day that you return back to Allah. So, but the point is that it is among the very last revelation, this short surah. And furthermore, there is a report from Ibn Abbas, who was had lived in the service of the Prophet ﷺ for a long time, for about 10 years, that when this surah was revealed, and again the report says that Umar and Abu Bakr took it as as news of good tidings, because it says if Allah's victory comes, and so they took this as, and it was after Fath Makkah, after the Mecca was defeated, that this surah tells Muslims, informs Muslims that they will be victorious, and so they were happy. And according to this report, Ibn Abbas started crying, and they said, "Why are you crying?" He said, "Because this surah is telling us to say farewell to the Prophet. The Prophet ﷺ is approaching his end." And and then I'm not going to get into the whole thing about the authenticity debates and the different versions and different narratives and all of that stuff. But structurally, the surah itself is quite straightforward. إِذَا جَاءَ نَصْرُ اللَّهِ وَالْفَتْحِ. Now, note here that the grammatical expressions within the surah itself, it is mutlaq and am, that it addresses a general condition. It is phrased normatively and not simply as if it is commenting about a historical happening. Now, why is that significant? Because the question is the surah playing the specific function among the revelation that addresses the particularity of the prophecy of the Prophet ﷺ? There are surah, there are revelations that address something specific to the Prophet as the Prophet. So, for instance, the most famous example of that is don't raise your voice when you talk to the Prophet or when you are in the Prophet's company. This revelation is specific only to the Prophet and has no normative bearing beyond the Prophet. Its importance was that it addressed something at the time that the Prophet ﷺ was alive, and its normative significance has ended with the death of the Prophet ﷺ. Surah al Nasr, however, has a far more complicated status than that, because it is articulated normatively, stated normatively in general terms, and not in terms specific to the Prophet, and it doesn't even mention the Prophet. We understand it as heralding, because it is addressing itself in a very, if the victory of Allah comes, and you see the religion of Allah victorious and people are entering it in large numbers, people are joining or people are converting large numbers, it doesn't explicitly tell the Prophet you're going to die. It simply says, فَسَبِّحْ نصر الله الفتح ورأيت الناس يدخلون في دين الله أفواجا فسبح بحمد ربك واستغفره إنه كان توابا. فسبح بحمد ربك واستغفره إنه كان توابا. So tasbih, we all know that when you say subhanallah, that tasbih, praise be to Allah. فَسَبِّحْ بِحَمْدِ رَبِّكَ the واستغفره. So saying subhanallah wa bihamdih, Allahumma astaghfiraka wa atubu ilayk, that is often the tasbih, and it is reported that after this revelation, the Prophet ﷺ would constantly repeat in some reports say that non-stop, whenever they would see the Prophet, he's muttering subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik astaghfiruka wa atubu ilayk, that tasbih is being repeatedly articulated by the Prophet day and night all the time until he dies. So whether that's a year, 2 years, or 6 months, but there is even a report that Abu Bakr, he notices the Prophet in this constant state of tasbih, and so he tells the Prophet, ما هذا الذي استحدثته. It says, I don't remember it. The Arabic is eluding me, but basically, ما هذا الذي استحدثته. Now I don't remember what comes after استحدثته, meaning what is this new expression that the new prayer, new dhikr that you are saying, and then the Prophet ﷺ says, this is what I've been commanded to repeat until I. Now, that report is suspect for a million different reasons, but anyway, it's among the reports that you'll find in the penumbra in the community of meanings that have formed around the different surah. Okay. So now, most commentators agree that this surah has a normative impact as well as a historical significance. The historical significance is that it is telling the Prophet ﷺ, the end is near, your message is coming to a close. Turn your attention towards tasbih and tahmeed wal istighfar. Praising Allah, gratitude towards Allah, and asking Allah for forgiveness. Now, of course, theologians and commentators did not fail to notice the Prophet ﷺ was already among a promised heaven. This is not someone that needs Allah's forgiveness to go to heaven, right? And furthermore, as a human being, he's sinless. So the very act of asking forgiveness, and in fact we have companions go to the Prophet ﷺ and say, what can you possibly be asking Allah to forgive you for? Now, the reason they would note this is because they would note that it has a normative impact other than simply asking Allah for forgiveness. That the very act of tasbih wa tahmeed wa istighfar has a function beyond simply asking for actual forgiveness for actual sins. So in other words, it doesn't matter whether you believe you are a sinner or not a sinner, whether you have the sins of the world on your head, or it doesn't matter if you go to Hajj every year and you think that you are in great standing with Allah, although there's a lot to say about those who go to Hajj every year. But so التسبيح والتحميد والاستغفار has a function upon a human being and a human being's relationship to Allah other than the legalistic act of sin and forgiveness. So far, so good? You all with me?
Yes.
We'll save the questions till then. Okay. So then, next. So if it has a normative role, if the surah is normatively intended beyond its historical contextuality, what is it telling us, and what is it educating us about? What is the moral lesson that we are taking from this surah? And here the language is of critical importance. إذا جاء نصر الله والفتح ورأيت الناس يدخلون في دين الله أفواجا فسبح بحمد ربك واستغفره إنه كان توابا. Ibn Arabi has a very interesting comment about this, and he says, if you want to understand this surah, consider its opposite. What if you are in a situation where people are not entering God's religion in droves and great numbers? What if you are in a situation where people are leaving God's religion in droves and great numbers? Think about that. We even have a hadith, not reliable in my opinion, but a hadith that says في أول الإسلام يدخلون الناس في دين الله أفواجا وفي آخر الزمان يخرجون الناس من دين الله أفواجا. That at the beginning of time, or beginning of Islam, people will be entering in great numbers, and towards the end of time, people will be leaving Islam in great numbers. So, I mean, that's whether the authenticity of this hadith is accepted or not, but anyway, among the communities of meaning around this surah. And so Ibn Arabi then, as I said, an interesting point, said, well, what if this, in fact, this hadith, among other reports, in hadith al-fitan, the fitan literature, people are leaving. So would you extract from the surah that if people are leaving in droves, then you should not do tasbih wa tahmid wa istighfar?
No.
So what is the significance then that it says, if Allah's victory comes and you see people entering in huge numbers, فَسَبِّحْ بِحَمْدِ رَبِّكَ وَاسْتَغْفِرْهُ إِنَّهُ كَانَ تَوَّابًا, then why does it give you the positive possibility rather than the negative possibility? We've dealt with the historical significance, right? Now we're dealing with the normative significance.
Promise, kind of promise.
It's a promise
Kind of.
to,
Because that
Yeah.
is a.
but it is not dalil ala al-wa'd. It's not necessarily, it's a possibility, but not necessarily a promise. It's not a commitment.
Humility and victory.
You're getting hotter. Very close. Do you want to elaborate?
You have to, I mean, don't forget Allah just because things seem to be going well.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, I mean, you're, and this is the point that is always made about this one, is that what the nature of human beings, طبيعة النفس الإنسانية, the nature of human beings, is that if there is loss, if there is defeat, they have no problem begging and pleading with Allah and asking Allah for forgiveness and for victory and for help and for najda. As some say, طبيعة الناس جبلت على الاستنجاد, that you're in trouble, you cry for help. But this surah is talking about the conditionality of hubris, when in fact things are going well and going precisely in every sense your way. At that time, particularly at that time, is the time that you must recall your utter dependency on Allah, and that much of the revelation of the Quran, by the way, bolsters this in the same narrative, in the same normativity, and the same lesson, is that victory doesn't mean ذهبت السيئات عني. Doesn't mean that now you are free from sin, because the nature of human beings is that when they're tested with hardship, as the Quran reminds us, is that they start thinking about what they've done wrong, and they start making promises to Allah that, help us, and we're not going to do this again, we're not going to do that again. But when things are going their way, they immediately start thinking that, minimizing their faults and minimizing their sins. And the other thing, which Latifa min al-Lata'if, and this is in Jilani. Jilani says that especially people as they, when inshallah you get older, you get my age or older, inshallah, than that, as you get more advanced in your age, subhanAllah, although logically you're closer to death, and logically you know that the older you get, you are closer to death. But the older you exist, the older you live, in fact, you tend to forget about your sins. It's not that you actually think more about your sins. It takes an affirmative, and this you'll understand when you get older, inshallah. So just wait until it comes. Your memory towards your sins and your sense of guilt about your sins weakens. It doesn't actually grow. And indeed, and you might, even if you're lucky enough to have successful children and successful grandchildren, you sort of look at your children and say, MashaAllah, I've done, alhamdulillah, I've done a great job. You look upon your grandchildren and say, MashaAllah, I've done a great job. But in fact, the affirmative act is to humble yourself just because you have passed the trials and tribulations of youth, or they're a distant memory. It doesn't mean that you become, as often happens, a sort of a sense of apathy about your own past. And that's extremely dangerous. And you'll actually, that is one of the reasons that you'll find younger people, ironically, will tend to be more zealous about their relationship with their religion, with their deen. And you find older people, and you find them more settled in their ways. Although logically you think, you're closer to death than I am. But I am more zealous about Islam than you are, although, you might die in a year from now. Why is that? It's because they did not heed the warning of Surah al Nasr. That's precisely why. If the Prophet ﷺ, and he is the Prophet, and I've said that in several of my khutbahs, that Muslims don't think about this enough. This is the Prophet ﷺ himself. And Allah tells him, okay, your death is near. Your death is near is not, the Prophet at the time didn't know that, whether his death is going to be a week or a year. And in fact, in some reports, it's 2 years before he goes. But what he's charged with is tasbih wa tahmid wa istighfar. Then how about you? You meaning the normal human being. And especially, and I know that most of the people who watch this are younger in age. And this is, by the way, so sociologically typical. Older people are more settled in their ways, and they think, I don't need to listen to tafsir. I don't need to listen to teaching. it's remarkable. We grow closer to death, but we become more arrogant in our relationship. And that's one of the true ironies of human psychology that Allah warns us about. And so Surah al Nasr, although we teach it to our children, they memorize it, they recite it in prayer, the way it is taught to our children, because we have lost our relationship with our interpretive tradition. We don't read enough tafsir. I mean, some of us, the most that we'll download on our phones, although, I hate reading any tafsir electronically. It just sort of feels wrong. But anyway, that's because I'm a dinosaur. You don't have to be a dinosaur. But, we'll have Tabari, maybe Qurtubi or Ibn Kathir on our phones and so on. But the cumulative interpretive tradition offers us centuries of engagements with these texts and centuries of reflections. And keep in mind that in modernity, we have produced far less. The corpus of tafsir produced in modernity is far less than the corpus of tafsir produced in pre-modernity. So we used to write about the Quran actually before the printing press far more than we do now. And that has a great deal of significance and a great deal of meaning. Okay. Any questions? Because before we move on from Surah al Nasr?
Doesn't this apply to everything, not only to the Quran? We count on the past and we are comfortable saying, oh yeah, our previous people did this and this and this. Like in case of Egyptians, the Pharaoh did this and this and that, and we have a great science. The scientist, whoever discovered something, and it applies exactly to
I just, in the case of our Islamic tradition, I want people to even bother. I'll be happy if they bother learning that tradition. I mean, modern Muslims, and especially Arab Muslims, nearly without exception. I mean, subhanAllah, although of course I'm an Arab, but Arab Muslims have become the worst. I can say that because I'm an Arab. It's like being a Jew and saying something about Jews. Arab Muslims have become the worst. We take our tradition. I wish we were even proud about it. I mean, we might be proud about the first four caliphs and maybe Umar bin Abdul Aziz, but our attitude towards the balance of our tradition is horrible. I mean, we're ignorant and bigoted against our own tradition. I hear on Egyptian TV, of course it's not good for my health to watch Egyptian TV, but I hear on Egyptian TV, Egyptians talk about the Islamic tradition in ways that are just horrific. Out of complete ignorance and bigotry. I mean, they're as bad as Islamophobes. As bad as Islamophobes. The Islamic tradition stands for despotism. Islamic tradition, all the bigoted prejudices of Orientalism has moved into the consciousness of the modern Muslim intellectual. And they'll speak about their tradition in the most dismissive and degrading fashion. It's horrific. It's mind-boggling, and that's why, by the way, all things are intimately connected. That's why our manuscripts are lost everywhere, because you can't. And when you talk to, you go talk to. My experience is mostly with Egyptians. So you go talk to Egyptians who have the money and say save manuscripts, and they'll look at you and like, well, why? What's the point of saving? The past. It's just these. You want to tell me there's something in the Islamic past that's worth saving? If it doesn't go back to Abu Bakr or Omar or Uthman or Ali and they don't even care very much anymore about Ali and maybe or Omar bin Abdul. Then they have no interest and they have no knowledge and they just think very much like the prejudices of Oriental despotism, the mythology that the West invented about the Orient is accepted by Muslims verbatim. I don't know if my experience was intellectuals in Morocco has been somewhat better, but intellectuals in Tunisia are as bad as Egyptians.
They're worse.
Huh?
I think they're the worst. I really
Yeah,
think they're the
actually.
worst.
Anyway. I mean, let's leave the Arab world where the Arab world is, because Islam is not the Arab world. But I used to have a great deal of hope for Muslims in the West to pioneer a renaissance. Unfortunately, the Arab world has infected Muslims in the West with all their illnesses, all the illnesses that have developed in their psyche from colonialism. And again, Bernard Lewis and Daniel Pipes and these people say, oh, when are you going to stop blaming colonialism? It's not a matter of blaming, it's a matter of learning history. Yeah, we've developed psychoses during the colonial era. These psychoses make us look at our tradition dismissively, including, by the way, the Quran. And you can't talk about decolonialism and intellectualize about decolonialism until you recognize that you have these psychoses and these prejudices against your own tradition. Anyway, so Surah al Nasr, that's mostly what I have to say about it. Any questions about Surah al Nasr?
What was the point that you made that you were saying Jelani said something and I missed?
Who?
Jelani.
This was in the context of,
Just as you get older.
huh?
As you get older, you get more so.
Yeah, the
That was
point,
his
yeah,
point?
that's the point, that Jilani was made, I mean, several people made it, but Jilani articulated it most eloquently, that the sense of hubris about victory is that as you get older, people tend, if they, of course you could get older and your life has been a disaster, and then that doesn't apply. But Jilani made the comment that often older people, their memory of their memories towards their sins and their faults become far more weakened, or the connection, their consciousness about the things they've done wrong. And in fact, you reminded me, Jilani says that when elsewhere in the Quran Allah talks about people who say, سَيَغْفِرُ اللَّهُ لَنَا, that Allah will forgive us. And Allah comments to this, أَتَّخَذْتُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ عَهْدًا, have you received a promise from Allah and Allah doesn't know about? And Jilani comments that if you find this attitude quite often with older people. As they get old, their attitude towards the sins is, oh well, Allah will forgive it. Allah is merciful, Allah will just forgive it. Although Allah told them, how do you know that? How can you be so arrogant? So, in the context of commenting about Surah al Nasr, he says that hubris, that bombastic, apathetic attitude towards your own sin, you are directly addressed by فَسَبِّحْ بِحَمْدِ رَبِّكَ وَاسْتَغْفِرْهُ, because if no one could have been in a better position than the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, and so the nearer to death you are, it applies to you the more than it. In fact, logic, if we were logical human beings, and you truly believed that no one gets to be 50, 60, or 70 without having committed plenty of sins in their life. No. But if you truly believe that you are responsible for these sins, and that you must pay your bill in this earth before you pay in the hereafter, you would be in a constant state of tasbih. If the Prophet ﷺ himself, according to these reports, was in a constant state of tasbih in the final year of his life, then how about you? Now, there is another thing that your question reminded me of, so I'm actually happy you asked about Jilani, is that, but this is not limited to Jilani, this is Jilani, Ibn Arabi, all the Sufi commentaries on the Quran make the same point about Surah al Nasr, is that they say that, as in Surah Al-Rahman, we talk about the first layer of meaning and the second layer and the third layer and so on. They say that the layer of meaning, غير الظاهر, other than the zahir meaning, is that being in a state of istighfar wa tasbih wa tahmid is Nasrullah wal Fath, is the victory that comes from Allah. That if you are in constant, and this lived experience, the cumulative testimony of those who have put themselves, who have committed to, and especially those who have done it through the Sawm and Kalam, those who commit themselves that I'm not going to talk to a human being for 40 days, and then for 40 days I'm going to be in constant tasbih wa tahmid wa istighfar. Subhanallah, alhamdulillah, astaghfirullah wa atubu ilayk. And so they do their prayer, they take 40 days in isolation, and they don't talk to anyone, and by the time you're done with this, you truly feel the sense of Nasrullah wa Fath, the victory of Allah enters your heart in a way that cannot be described, that can only be experienced. So, of course, this is the famous methodology of a lot of Sufi tariqas, that whether, they 40 days is the common one, but some extend it to longer than that, some do it shorter than that. And you don't have to belong to a Sufi tariqa to understand that. Because Al-Qushayri, for instance, in his commentary on Surah al Nasr, who makes, and by the way, there's a good book in English about the Tafsir Al-Qushayri. It's amazing how many good books in English exist about the Islamic tradition. It was written as a PhD dissertation and then was published. But Qusayri, for instance, when he talks about Surah Al-Fath, he says that Surah Al-Nasr, ظاهرها الوداع, that its external meaning, its explicit meaning is to say goodbye to the Prophet ﷺ. باطنها تعليم الناس كيف يكون نصر الله والفتح. But its batin here, its true meaning, or its essential meaning, is to teach people how to attain Allah's victory and fath within themselves. And of course, that through the mechanism of istighfar, التسبيح والتحميد والاستغفار. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك استغفرك واتوب اليك. Now, we can have an entire halaqa just on this expression, التسبيح والتحميد والاستغفار, because the tasbih, amazingly beautiful thing has been written about that expression, subhanallah. Amazingly beautiful things. And amazingly beautiful things have been written on alhamdulillah. You can have entire halaqas, hours on just subhanallah and alhamdulillah. And of course, we will revisit it in many other surahs, so I don't want to, do as in Surah al-Rahman and spend all these hours just on subhanallah, alhamdulillah, but enough at this stage to remember that this surah, which is among the last revealed in the Quran, last surah, but not last ayat, last surah, last full surah, revealed of the Quran, and it comes educating you on that process of introspection and retrospection, the way you look back at your entire life, and how fundamental that connection to the divine is, that you cannot ever allow to waver, particularly when things are going your way. Because when things go our way, that's when our relationship to Allah weakens. By the way, you want to, when my mother used to tell me, used to tell me that when she was among the first people to, go back. When she first visited Kuwait, this was in the 50s, Kuwait was not developed. She would tell me that Kuwaitis used to be very religious. Now, by the time the 80s and 90s come around, wealth has twisted not just Kuwaiti personalities, but all Gulfi personalities. Saudi, Kuwaitis, and money has twisted it. And the type of religiosity that existed in the 50s and 60s has changed completely. That's part of, and in fact, when I visited Saudi many times, and one of the things that amazed me is that one of the things that got me into a lot of trouble, it started a long time ago in Philadelphia. I gave a khutbah, and I said in the khutbah that if, this was over 20 years ago now, maybe 30 years, anyway, I said in the khutbah that if Muslims wanted to rethink their condition, breaking the bonds of colonialism, even back then, and my obsession was what have colonialism done to us, and what is that they would not just think about Hijaz as the seat of the Khilafah that is separate and autonomous, and that not Saudi but collectively Muslim. And I wasn't talking about Saudi, but oil as the collective property of the Muslim Ummah. And oh my Lord, things went nuts. People went crazy. They banned me from giving khutbahs in that masjid in Philadelphia. The Saudis got very upset. How could you say that oil belongs to all Muslims? How could you even suggest that this idea? This is because this is Allah's gift to Saudis, and that sense of Nasr Allah al Fath. This was our Nasr and our Fath. This is ours, and it's because you're Egyptian and you want to steal our oil, and the idea that this resource, this natural resource, belongs to the Muslim Ummah, and that Muslim Ummah should mine it collectively and should break away from the nationalist way of thinking. And and it didn't help. I thought, well, I have the same attitude about Qanat al-Suez, and at that time, Egyptian gas is going to Israel, and I said, are you happy about Egyptian gas going to Israel? Wouldn't you rather this gas be the ownership of all Muslim Ummah? I said, no, this is, you can't compare Egyptian gas to our oil. Anyway, so I was very young then, and it was one of the painful lessons that I learned that, you could get into a lot of trouble for your ideas and things you say. And so not only was I banned, but they didn't want me to, the Saudis said we don't want him to come to the masjid, and then it turned out that I had a Saudi friend who was actually originally Egyptian, but he got Saudi citizenship. He came to me and he said the Saudi consulate has warned the Saudi students not to talk to you, not to sit with you, not to deal with you. And so, then began the whole journey. This was in the 80s.
This isn't the one where they chased you down the street with the...
No, the one where they chased me down the street and threw sure at me.
In Texas.
It was in Texas. It's not Saudi, but it was the same type of ideas. It was the same type of ideas, alhamdulillah.
Yeah, so
Although
many
the
stories like
concept of what you had suggested, that the oil belongs to the Islamic Ummah or the Muslim Ummah, is just so fantastic. If you apply this from the biggest thing as oil or whatever to the tiniest thing, that really nothing in life belongs to us.
It is the essence of decolonialism. It's the essence of decolonialism. Because, and this, what has been very informative in my life is the loss of Palestine.
Yes.
How Palestine, how the entire Europe marshaled in the Reconquista and the genocide against Muslims, and the way that entire Europe supported the Reconquista, and the way that you look up, you could do this even on people who know how to use computers. You could look up the newspaper headlines when Jerusalem fell. The newspaper headlines in Britain and the United States was Jerusalem returns to Christianity after years of occupation. You could look up the American newspapers and the British newspapers, you'll see it. And this was extremely formative because, and also my legal experience later on in seeing the European Union form, and also seeing the way that resources, natural resources, were shared between European nations, the same nations that were educating Muslim intellectuals on nationalism and boundaries. But look at the legal treaties between, forget, Trump is the exception, because he's reversing a lot of things. But between, for instance, the US and Canada, or the US and England, or Sweden and Norway, or France and Belgium and Netherlands, you're in for a ride. If you study the legal arrangements, we Muslims can't even conceive of anything like that. So, anyway, memories. The reason that it's just I thought, I remembered when the Saudi students were talking about Saudi oil. They kept telling me that that's a sign of Muslim law, that Allah loves the Saudis, that Allah loves, that He gave us all this oil, and so you can't steal it from us. And it was just a khutbah. It wasn't. If I wanted to get banned from giving khutbahs in the Islamic Center, I would come up and say that. Then I assure you, that will be the last khutbah I give. You get. I've put, I don't know if I have forgotten my sins as I've gotten older personally. I actually, alhamdulillah, I tend to make an effort to think about my sins even as a teenager, because otherwise if you forget them, it's extremely, then you also fail to understand the reality of and how close you are to death. But I've you learn through the hard way that the extent to which becoming alienated from being anchored in Quranic morality has costed us, and that the older I've gotten, the more it has hit home, because you see how so many things do not comport to logic, but comport to essential communitarian values and basic values. Okay, anything else about Surah al Nasr? Then
فسبح بحمد ربك واستغفره إنه كان توابا.
yeah, see? Exactly what Surah al Nasr is saying.
Wow, it doesn't want to
That's
stop.
Because you opened the Surah.
Or is it because you
The phone.
Yeah, sorry.
Open the
I haven't
Quran.
figured it out yet.
is this your phone ringing or?
No, I opened it up on my app.
Yeah.
Oh,
And then
that's
click,
why.
and
I
then-
thought subhanAllah, your ringer is.
You're in a state of
It's like
tasbih.
Muhsin is just like beating with it. Yeah. Okay.
Short question, Professor. I don't know if we connect the current situation of Muslim, as we always say here, that we are defeated, we are lost, we are humiliated, and say to the surah that during the proper time, we know that from the Tafsir, what meaning here with the Nasrullah is basically the Prophet going to have a victory to the Meccans during the Fathul Makkah. Is there any interpretation in Tafsir what really mean with Nasrullah and Fath? And then if there is a substantive meaning or interpretation for this, and we connect to our situation today in order to achieve again, our, let's say, victory, and how we can seek the Nasr of God or the help of God to achieve or to regain our dignity in modern life.
Okay, so first, as is my methodology always, is to tell you the reports and the layers of meaning. So yes, you'll find in the Tafsir many that say the reference to Nasrullah wal Fath here is specifically referring to Mecca and the defeat of Mecca. But you'll also then find some saying, no, it is not Mecca, but it's referring to Banu Ghatafan, the defeat of the tribe of Banu Ghatafan. I'll actually, maybe it's a good thing you asked about this. Hold on. Maybe I'll find it. Hold on. Yeah, so then in these some reports which are rather interesting, it says no, it is the victory, the entry of most of Yemen into Islam. What I was looking for is the hadith. There's a hadith, reported hadith that says الدين يمان والفقه يمان والحكمة يمانية. أنه قال إني لأجد نفس ربكم من قبل اليمن. There are these hadiths that say that fiqh, wisdom, and true religion will come from Yemen, and even that says that the breath of your Lord is from Yemen. Now, of course, this is rather, I was thinking about these hadiths recently, because when you think about what is happening to Yemen today, what Saudi and the Emirat are doing in Yemen, of course the Yemeni tribes are the heart of Arabs. The Arabs came from the Yemeni tribes, and the role of Yemen in early Islamic identities is enormous and undeniable. But all of this is, what is the ayah referring to? Is it Mecca? Is it Banu Ghatafan? Is it Yemen? what I was then the reason I brought this book with me is that because I wanted to read this quote, which it's a good thing you asked this question because I had forgotten. وإنما عبر عن الحصول بالمجيء تجاوزا للإشعار بأن المقدرات متوجهة حين إلى أوقاتها المعينة لها فتعرف منها شيئا فشيئا وقد قرب النصر من وقته فكن مترقبا لوروده مستعدا لشكره. So this quote basically says, well, it's not really referring to any historical unfolding. It's not talking about Mecca or Yemen or Banu Ghatafan. What it is talking about is that the victories of Allah are part of your destiny, and they will unfold in time. And whether you've attained this victory materially now or not, your attitude must be in constant readiness for the unfolding of Allah's fate. Now, interestingly, Al-Qushayri comments on this and says, if you have true Iman, then whatever Allah decrees to you is your victory. That's sort of a very Sufi type attitude, that whether it's hardship or ease, you look at it as a victory, as Nasrullah, because it's your qadr. Anyway, that's rather classic of the Sufi commentators. But then, as to the other point about, well, إذا جاء نصر الله والفتح رأيت الناس يدخلون في دين الله أفواجا, there are two main attitudes. I could call them the pessimists, who thought, at the beginning, people will be entering Islam in large numbers, and towards the end of days, people will be leaving Islam in large numbers, and there's nothing you can do about it. And they limit themselves to talking about, what about Ahmad Atif wrote the book Fatigue of Sharia, which talks about this whole genre of literature, that the generations that will exist close to the end of times, they will see everyone leaving Islam. Their job is basically to hold on to the truth and watch. There's nothing they can do, and these are the pessimists. Those who you can with this trend exists another trend which did not rely on ahadith al-fitan, and because they didn't accept the authenticity of ahadith al-fitan and didn't believe that that there will come a time when everyone is leaving Islam. Sometimes they even refer to some hadiths that say that towards the end of times everyone would enter Islam, but whether they relied on these hadiths or not, their attitude was one not of pessimism, but rather contingency that victory or greater victory is possible if Muslims do the right thing. And there, what is common nearly to all of them is the insistence on whether Allah grants victory to Muslims again, whether Allah it entirely depends on how Muslims discharge their obligation, their khilafah. So they had all of them accepted that dinu baqin, that Islam itself will stay. But the question is, whether one generation will be victorious with Islam or will betray Islam entirely depends on how they discharge the aqd al-istikhlaf, or their obligation of viceroyship with Allah. And that second school had a huge impact on a lot of the so-called Muslim modernists. So all of the Muslim modernists, from, you know, whether it's Muhammad Iqbal or Kawakibi or Muhammad Abdu or Shah Wali, to one extent or another were affected by, you know, I don't want to call them optimists because they're, you know, but okay, let's call them optimists.
Less pessimist.
Yeah, because they're counter pessimists, right? They're maybe they're thinking things in terms of contingency. But anyway, so all of the modernists were influenced clearly by the optimistic school. At the same time, all those who rejected al-Khuruj al-Hakim and rebelling against colonial powers, because remember that during colonialism, the major debate whether you rebel against colonizing powers or not, all those who refused to rebel against colonialism and then later on against unjust rulers relied on the pessimist school. And all those who rebelled against colonialism and later on wanted to rebel against unjust rulers relied on the optimistic school, what I'm calling the optimistic school. This issue rekindled itself in very fascinating ways from an intellectual academic point of view after the Arab Spring, because all the Wahhabi / Salafi I hesitate because I don't like calling them scholars, but okay. All the Wahhabi / Salafi scholars who are now preaching that the revolution, that the Syrian revolution was a fitna, the Egyptian revolution was a fitna, etc., that it was haram, that Allah is punishing us for rebelling, that even the idea that Saudi initially adopted, that they insist on the removal of Assad, that now that you don't remove Assad because Assad is the punishment for all those who rebelled, are going back to the Hadith al-Fitan and going back to the Pessimist school. And this is fascinating.
Yeah.
And all it's one of the, I was thinking of writing this article, but it's, there were, in Egypt there were 75 people sentenced to death in one day.
Yes.
I know a lot of these people, 75, right?
Yeah, around 70.
Yeah. I know a lot of these people, and I know that theologically, all the people that I know among the 75 are influenced to one extent or another by the optimist school. Because they actually don't believe it's you just give up and everyone will be leaving Islam and just so sometimes following the optimist school can end up with you getting the death sentence, I guess. I guess people with power don't like optimism.
Cannot control enough.
Yeah, they want grouchy pessimists who see there's no point in trying anything or doing anything, and might as well just sit at home and
Listen to them.
huh?
And listen to them.
Watch Netflix and eat kharoof and eat sheep and rice and get fat and buy cars and you have to laugh about it because otherwise but it is quite remarkable that again, from this one surah, so much is unpacked, and so much that connects to our present, and our past, and our history, and schools of interpretation, and methodologies towards hermeneutics, the way that interpreting history interacts with interpreting language. If you are, from an intellectual point of view, it's entirely fascinating. And it all has very pragmatic but effects. But the one thing I underscore in Surah al Nasr, if there is a single thing that you take away from Surah al Nasr, the importance of tasbih wa tahmid wa istighfar. I mean, and the closer you get, remember, death can come at any time. I mean, my sister is a forensic doctor, and she tells me all the time how very young people, hardly a single day passes without some young person ending up on her dissection table, you know, and she opens them up and so on.
What's the English translation for those 3 words?
What?
Tasbih wa tahmid wa istighfar. Tasbih is the saying Subhanallah, praise to Allah. Tahmid, saying Alhamdulillah, which, or gratitude be to Allah, or thank Allah. Wa istighfar is to say Astaghfirullah, which means asking Allah for forgiveness. These are the but learning the Arabic and repeating them in Arabic, I think, is very important for the process of dhikr, because they have a supernal spiritual power. These words, the articulation of these words, have a power, and they have a power on your aura, a direct power on your aura. And they transform, and I'll tell you from my experience, they transform your molecular structure.
Your what?
Your molecular structure. They change the molecules
Yes.
that of your being and your body, and they cleanse you. Dhikr has that impact on you, and the longer you do it, the more your relationship to it is so personal. You become it becomes far more powerful for you. It is truly like its power, its energy, its thrust is monumental. But at the same time, you learn to have a very sensitive radar to your company, the company you keep, and the company you pray with, and the company you do dua and dhikr with. And I always tell people, listen to that voice. You don't listen to, when young kid comes to me who's, maybe I've done some, they do their prayers and they do the sunnah, and they go, I listen to my inner voice. No, don't listen to your inner voice. Your inner voice is noise. You're not experienced of it. It's like someone's still practicing the cello and learning the skills, and tells me, I don't think it makes a difference whether it's Rostroporovic or Jacqueline Dupree, and I say, just go practice. Shut up and go practice. You probably can't tell the difference between Rostroporovic and Jacqueline Dupree. But it's when you develop that sensitivity that your voice becomes refined. And then you listen very carefully to that voice. I'm saying this to encourage you to develop it, because it has a power where all the things that you see people intellectualizing about with a great deal of stupidity, you have a perception that it doesn't bother you anymore. It doesn't even have any impact on you, because the certitude that you have in Allah is upon foundations that cannot be shaken, that are non-negotiable. and that's a great deal of tranquility. And it is truly a Nasr, but it's a Nasr that you can never be arrogant about, because the minute you are arrogant about it, the minute it becomes deceptive. Okay, any other questions about Surah al Nasr before we pray? Because we need to pray Asr.
Yeah, we're at 6:28.
Or 6:28? Good, so. Okay, shall we pray Asr then?